David will certainly participate in the chat and answer any questions that you have about TrainingPros, in addition to any information about the recording, which will be available after the session, and then also any questions related to the Learning Views blog as well. And finally, a final screen on some of the areas in which TrainingPros consults and provides learning and development consultants for companies in a variety of different areas and for a variety of different projects. And we thank TrainingPros for partnering with us on this webinar series and being a great distribution and marketing partner with us as we explore different areas of learning and emerging technologies. So once again, my name is Andy Petrosky, and we'll just give a moment for the screen to load here and things to get set. I am the Director and Assistant Professor of Learning Technologies at Harrisburg University of Science and Technology, and have some of my contact information on the screen there, and would love for you to connect with me as part of continuing conversation on this session or exploration of emerging and learning technologies in general. We do want to note, and everyone has, for the most part, everyone has participated, or looks like a lot of folks have participated in the kind of opening chat and letting us know where you're coming from, and that's great. Continue to comment and ask questions in the text chat. I may not be able to get to all of them because of the volume of participants we have, which is great, but we do a follow-up blog post as part of these Learning Views webinars. So if I'm not able to address your questions directly or through what I'm sharing in our presentation, we will take a look at those questions and definitely address those in the follow-up blog post. I'll also ask you to note a Q&A area. And unfortunately, my green arrow only points to the right, but to the left of that green arrow is a Q&A area where you can type in questions that may be a little bit lengthier, or you want to make sure don't get caught in the text chat scroll. Please do not type questions in the Q&A regarding audio or questions about the distribution of the recording or anything like that. Please keep the Q&A focused on questions directly related to our topic today, so appreciate that. A little bit about my role at the university. In addition to coordinating the Learning Technologies Master of Science program, I also work with faculty at the university to help them integrate technology into their courses, and I do work on problem-based learning and serious game projects with clients through our Center for Advanced Entertainment and Learning Technologies. In the LTMS program, I teach a micro-instructional design course where students work with real-world clients to put into practice the concepts that we'll be exploring today. In fact, the course will be taught next semester, and I'm still looking for some new clients for students, so if you're interested in a student working on a problem-based learning solution for you, please definitely contact me. We asked you to note your reason for attending the webinar when you registered, this word cloud in the form of a water droplet, and that'll have a little bit more, that'll make the reason for that shape will make a little bit more sense as we move forward. This is a representation of the types of answers that were provided by the 175 plus people that registered for this webinar. Overall, everyone is looking for new ideas and techniques to enhance their current instructional design work, and everyone just generally wants to learn about new topics like the one we'll explore today. 2 points I do want to note based on the information collected during registration. What we'll talk about today is micro-instructional design, and that does not specifically relate to micro-learning. What we'll be talking about is a process for designing learning different from Addie and other commonly known instructional design models. It can be used to create any size or length or volume of learning solutions. So even though micro is in the term, the solutions themselves are not necessarily micro-learning solutions. And some of you may or may not be familiar with that term micro-learning as well as micro-instructional design. But micro-instructional design is what we'll be exploring today. What we'll talk about today is going to be a foundation for serious game design and talking about designing games for learning. We'll address a transition from micro-instructional design to game design at the end of the session, but we won't be specifically talking about games throughout today's session. So just to clarify those 2 points from some of your input during registration, and appreciate that input during that time. So instructional design is both a process and a strategy. Micro-instructional design models should provide a formula for designing user experience, engagement, and interaction that supports learning. In this online session, we'll explore David Merrill's Pebble in the Pond instructional design model for problem-based learning and consider how it can be applied to game-based learning design. We'll also look at micro-instructional design compared to more common instructional design models and look at examples of problem-based learning solutions. As you have questions or comments, like I said, please type those in the text chat and your more in-depth questions in the Q&A pod. So this is our plan for today and the primary things that we'll be exploring and talking about and taking a closer look at. At one point or another in our formal education, we've all been exposed to the concept of macro and microeconomics. To begin our exploration of micro-instructional design, I'd like to borrow from economics and have us think about that a little bit. Now, we can't make an explicit transfer of the macro and micro of economics to instructional design, but I believe we need to look at instructional design as having these two components, the macro being the whole system and the micro the specific instance of the design. This is the Addie instructional design model. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, and many even use it as their primary model for instructional design. Addie is a macro instructional design model. Its goal and use is to impact and manage the whole system of instructional design. And just to get a sense of where everyone is coming from today, I have a poll that I want to move out onto the screen to get a sense of who's using Addie as their primary model. If there's others that are using, if you're using another model, please indicate that as well. And if you do select that you are using another model, please type that model in the text chat, as well as if you select other, which I'm not quite sure what that would be within the context of this poll, but certainly if you're not using Addie and you're not using another model and you understand and you're using an instructional design model, then indicate other, and then please let me know what that is in the text chat. And we've got a good amount of responses already from folks, and a large majority using the Addie model. And then some others, Sam, connectivism. We'll talk about connectivism in a little bit. Sam is the success approximation model. And one that I also would note, or my perspective is that is also a macro instructional design model. As we move forward, I'd love to see some comments and thoughts on that. Okay, so appreciate you guys participating in that, and we'll have another poll coming up here, and love some similar types of feedback and comments throughout. So I'm going to delete that note from the Q&A and ask again that any notes or comments be typed in the chat, and any Q&A, any input into the Q&A is strictly questions related to the content and not comments or chat as related to what we're doing today or questions about other logistics. So thank you guys for that. I'm going to hide this poll now and take a look at macro instructional design and some of the things that sometimes result from that. So this is a visual representation of the type of experience that often occurs from traditional instructional design methods. Now, I'm painting with a very broad brush here. This page turner experience is where learners just click through information screen after information screen until they get to a quiz to test their memory on previous content. So this is probably, hopefully the percentage is reducing, but probably 70–80% of what we see in online learning or classroom learning even is that presentation of information with some assessment component indicated or implemented into it. Here's another version of the page turner. This time there's an activity that breaks up the information presentation, and that's great and an awesome strategy. But this is often a content-specific activity that is more about user interaction with the screen, like drag and drop activities, versus information that is mentally engaging or based off of solving a problem. So here, whoops, sorry guys, I have shouldn't be any timing issues here, but I'll just need to manage that. We want to move to a more robust learning experience that moves away from the presentation of information as the foundation of the design to problem solving as the cornerstone around which all learning occurs. In this design approach, information supports decisions and problem solutions versus being the foundation of the learning solution. To move to a more problem-based approach, I believe a more refined instructional design model is needed, or models, and that being a model for micro-instructional design. So as we look at the Addie model again and look at the different components of macro-instructional design, the design of instruction is one of those components, but it is not necessarily detailed as to how that design occurs. There are certain supports and there are theories and strategies behind that design element, but not a separate micro process. So that's what we're looking at today. So if Addie and other instructional design models are more the macro, what is macro instructional design? One of the things I want to emphasize as well before we dive too deep into that question is, and as we begin talking about micro instructional design, is that it is not a replacement for macro. Just like if you think of economics, there are two things that live symbiotically and support each other. It's an offshoot. It's a process for actually designing the instruction. Developing a more micro process for instructional design can help us move away from information, again, as the primary instructional tool that often results from design of learning objectives, of moving from learning objectives and analysis or the early stages of design directly into the design phase. So to think a little bit more about micro instructional design and maybe even some of the micro instructional design that we're already doing, I have another poll that I want to move out onto the screen here. And I'm just going to move this one around a little bit, cover up most of our slide, but just take a moment and click any of these models or guides or theories that. And again, if you select other, please type what that might be in the text chat. Thanks. Okay, thank you guys again for your participation there, and we have a large number of responses. So I'm gonna move forward, but please continuing while I have the poll out on the screen. Please continue interacting. All of these are obviously helpful models and guidelines, and as we look at a micro instructional design process, we don't leave these behind. These are still things that we incorporate into our design, but I've found that these models and guides don't really help us create effective, efficient, and engaging instruction that is not based on information. Furthermore, these are all models or principles that hit on various aspects of designing instruction, and they don't provide a cohesive approach to designing instructional experiences. So, we've got 10, 12, 14 different models or guides there, and other folks indicating other models and guides that they use in the chat. So, we kind of tried to put together all of these pieces and all of these insights and theories as we design and develop, and we really do that through our own process, which again, sometimes or a lot of times often results in more information-based design versus problem-based, and again, a micro-instructional design model can help to impact that and create some cohesiveness around these strategies and these theories. And I see some folks indicating action mapping as something that they do in the text chat, and that's great to see, and actually something that we'll explore as part of today's session, or at least note as part of today's session. And what we do, or what we're going to talk about with micro-instructional design, is very akin to action mapping. There's a little bit more depth and a little more of a process to it, and some more instructional theory behind micro-instructional design than action mapping, but very similar approaches. So thanks again for that input. The Pebble in the Pond instructional design model from Dr. David Merrill is a micro-instructional design model that creates a process for micro-instructional design and moves away from a focus on information and towards a focus on learners solving problems as a primary part of instruction. So this is the micro-instructional design model that we'll explore today. We'll look at the whole model with the rest of the time we have today, but we'll primarily focus on the first three parts of the model. We'll also look at some examples of the type of learner experiences that can result from a micro-instructional design approach like Pebble in the Pond. And I'll refer to this from this point forward as PIP, the PIP model. The name itself I'm not really fond of, but luckily Dr. Merrill has put all his energy and research and practice into creating the model and not naming it. So with that in mind, we'll call it the PIP model as we go through the rest of the day. The Pebble in the Pond model is based off of the first principles of instruction. Dr. Merrill has written a book by that name, and we actually did a Learning Views webinar back in January on that topic. The PIP model is a process for implementing the first principles of instruction, and you'll notice as I've mentioned a few times and focused on problem-based learning, the PIP model or the first principles of instruction is based around a problem-based approach and the problem being at the center. As we move forward and think about that, consider that a problem-based approach, and just to kind of get us on the same page, a problem-based approach is one where learning is promoted when learners are engaged in solving real-world problems and making sure as we design, we need to make sure that the problems are authentic, that they're useful, that they're meaningful, and that they're intrinsically motivating to the student. So keep that in mind as we move forward and we look at the first principles of instruction and actually the PIP model to implement the first principles of instruction, and we'll consider and think about problems a little bit more as we begin to explore that model. The book, I just want to highlight that details the first principle of instruction and the PIP model is First Principles of Instruction, Identifying and Designing Effective, Efficient, and Engaging Instruction, written by Dr. Merrill. I don't get any residuals from the sale of the book, so I want to highlight that or make sure I emphasize that. It is the book we use for the micro-instructional design course we teach in the Learning Technologies MS program here at Harrisburg University. And it's a resource for you should you like what you experienced today and want to dive a little deeper after this session. I also have some other resources that I'll offer at the end of the session that will give you some opportunity to dive a little deeper into what we explore today. But I did want to highlight and note that the book is where all of these concepts come from, and I'm really just kind of taking some elements of the book and sharing them with you today based off of work that we've done with students in this PIP model, and also work again that we do with problem-based solutions through our Center for Advanced Entertainment and Learning Technologies. So let's start with just a brief overview of each step, and the overviews are going to be just that. So it'll be like a one-sentence quick kind of exploration or explanation of what we're going to focus on there, and then again we'll dive a little deeper into the first three and then look at some examples as well as what can result. So we already talked about a problem, and we'll dive a little deeper again after this overview into what problems are within a problem-based instructional design approach. But the first step is to identify a problem and design a demonstration and application for a portrayal of that problem, and we'll talk about portrayals in a minute as well. The second step is the progression. And designing a progression is focused on designing a simple to complex progression of problems and problem portrayals, and designing a demonstration and application for each of those. So through our first two steps, we're focusing on demonstrating problems and varying degrees of problems to learners, and then having them apply skills within those scenarios or those problem situations. Our third phase in the PIP model or Pebble in the Pond model is component skills, and in this stage or phase or step we determine a distribution of component skills across the progression of portrayals and design a demonstration and application for each component skill. As we move forward, I also have some diagrams that will explain this or demonstrate this model a little bit more, and those three primary steps, which again we'll explore in more detail here as we move forward. So we're being presented with problems through a series of problems. We're also practicing specific skills within those problems. So we're not tackling a entire problem necessarily, or all of the skills that are a part of an entire problem at one time, but we're doing that through a progression of problems. And then the other steps that we'll really kind of just highlight today and go over, and actually are very similar to many other instructional design processes, are really a lot of probably what you do today. And one of those last ones is enhancing strategies, and this focuses on designing a structural framework for the problems in the progression, designing things like peer sharing, discussion, collaboration, and critique. Finalizing design is focused on basically usability, appropriate interface, navigation, supplemental materials, and we'll look at that as part of one of our examples. So supplemental materials might be something like a job aid. And then evaluation, designing assessment opportunities and conducting a formative evaluation of the learning solution. So that's the overall model. Now let's take a little deeper dive into those first three areas. And again, if you have any questions or comments, please type those in the text chat. Any really detailed questions, please type those in the Q&A, and I appreciate those of you sharing some resources in the chat as well. Please continue to do that, as well as those of you who are familiar with action mapping or use action mapping. Would love to get your insights and your thoughts throughout on how this is similar and different from what you're doing with action mapping. So we've already talked about a problem and what it is to identify a problem, and again creating a demonstration and application of that problem. So what is a problem, or what does a problem look like? So in the first Principles of Instruction webinar in January, the participants of that session were asked to create a problem statement as the first step in creating a problem-based learning solution. So we actually worked through all the first principles of instruction as part of that session. Problem examples from the first session are displayed on the screen. The problems that kind of hit the mark or hit the target are on the left, and the problems that didn't hit the mark and are using as non-examples today are on the right. When you consider the concept of problem-based learning, it sounds natural and even simple, but when you try to move from a learning objective, information-based design world to a problem-based design, it can be difficult to make that leap. And establishing what the problem is, or what the problems are, is often the first step and the most difficult part to do, or the most difficult part of the leap to make there. So again, the problem statements on the left are ones that could lead to a problem-based instructional solution that is effective, efficient, and engaging. The statements on the right are more focused on information or strictly demonstration. They do not present a specific problem for the learner to solve. A problem-based micro-instructional design should focus on learners solving problems at the heart of the design. What I ask you to do, and you can certainly type this in the text chat if you'd like, or really just think about it on your own, is what your problem might be within a learning solution that you're either redesigning and want to create, want to result in a more effective, engaging, and efficient learning design, or maybe a new project that you just started off with. So again, feel free to type those in the text chat, or again, just think about a problem and consider that problem in relation to the other things that we'll look at as we step through this process. Again, take a moment to look at some of the problems on the left side of the screen and how those are specifically focused on performance and learners demonstrating skill. Our next step is the problem progression. Designing a simple to complex problem progression of problem portrayals and creating a demonstration or application of each portrayal in the progression. So that's the activity here. Problem progression is very similar to existing design concepts like zone of proximal development, scaffolding, flow, or cycles of expertise. Progression intends to present multiple opportunities for the learner to practice solving more and more complex and divergent problems so that the learner can apply the skills practiced to slightly unique situations outside of the training. So there are, I'm sure many of you who are creating problem-based solutions already. However, I would venture to guess that a majority of those solutions involve a lot of information presented to the learner before they get the opportunity to solve maybe one problem, maybe two problems, versus, again, the problem being the center and the learner being able to apply those skills and that information in a variety of different scenarios, so that there is critical thinking and there's true evaluation and analysis happening as part of problem solving that then can be applied to divergent and unique experiences in the workplace. And I believe I emphasized it at the beginning when talking about macro instructional design and existing models, that I was painting a very broad brush. So what we're talking about today is not something, a micro instructional design process is not something that's a requirement for creating problem-based or effective, engaging, and efficient instruction. But certainly I think the majority of learning design and learning solutions that occur from strictly macro instructional design models are very information-based. There's certainly a lot of great training and instruction happening and being created from those models, but I think the majority is probably on the side of information-focused, where we want to really move to a problem-based approach, and a micro instructional design like the one we're exploring today can help us do that. So this is where the PIP model begins to move us more towards that truly problem-based approach. As I said, as instructional designers, we probably already present learners with problems and scenarios in training, but the problems are often given after all that information or as a single experience, and rarely is there multiple opportunities to practice skills in a variety of situations. So the problem progression is a focus on that. Our third step, and again, actually the final step of the steps that we're going to focus on today before we dive in a little bit more into those three steps and look at them a little bit more holistically, is component skills. And in this step, we're determining a distribution of component skills across the progression of portrayals and designing a demonstration and application for each of those component skills. Component skills are the information, parts, categories, steps, and examples that support solving the problems in the problem progression. Component skills are presented within the context of problems versus separate knowledge that is learned before being presented with problems or scenarios. Again, kind of emphasizing what we just talked about with the progression and the way that a lot of designs or the results of a lot of designs that are strictly focused on a macro base. So all of that may or may not have made sense, but hopefully these diagrams will help explain it a little bit better and help us dive a little bit deeper. This diagram essentially represents what we've just been discussing regarding problem progression and component skills. Component skills are experienced within the context of solving a series of more complex problem scenarios. As the problem scenarios become more complex, the guidance that's given to the learner is reduced until the learner is solving the most complex problem scenario without any guidance. And I'll leave that diagram on the screen for just a second. And this diagram is from the First Principles of Instruction wiki, and I do have a link out to that wiki. Obviously, you can grab that here as well. A link out to that wiki in the resources that will be shared at the end of the session today. This is a diagram. This diagram is a little bit more in-depth representation of what a learning solution might look like based on the Pebble and the Pond model and the First Principles of Instruction. Read through the diagram by reading the number in the list at the top and then finding the corresponding number in the diagram. You can enlarge the screen if you'd like as well. There's a crosshairs button at the very top. And if you enlarge that, you can go full screen on your own. If you enlarge that, you'll lose all of the rest of the webinar, but you'll see the full screen, and then you can toggle back to the webinar by just clicking that button again. You need to move your mouse up to the top right of the full screen. The crosshairs button will display again. You can click it to come back to this view. So if you are having problems seeing this, or when we move to a document that I'll share with you, you may want to enlarge the screen on your own for that as well. So in the first step here, learners are shown a demonstration of a whole problem. The demonstration should show the proper way. Let me just grab here. There we are. The demonstration should show the proper way of completing the problem, or it could demonstrate a non-example with a summary of what went wrong. For the example of packing a kayak with safety guidelines for overnight wilderness camping, that was one of the problems that I showed on the screen a couple slides back, and one of the problems that came from our first session or our previous session on first principles of instruction back in January was that problem. So we're looking at packing a kayak within safety guidelines for overnight wilderness camping. In that example, or for that example, in this stage or this first part or first experience, the learners might be shown what results when the kayak is not packed correctly, with again a summary of some of the things that went wrong as part of that. Second, the learner would be presented with component skills specific to the problem. In the kayak example, the learner may be presented with 2 kayaks and asked to identify what's missing in the incorrectly packed kayak versus the correctly packed kayak. Information is presented through feedback, coaching, and guidance. The learner is still asked to be actively engaged during this component skill instruction. The third experience here would include or could include the component skills being demonstrated within the context of a problem. In the kayak example, again, there may be a demonstration of someone selecting the right materials for the kayak. So there's some presentation of the component skills and then some demonstration of them as well. In the fourth step here, another problem is presented in a different scenario. Back to our kayaking example, the kayaker may be asked to help another person pack a kayak for a camping trip in a different terrain or at a different time of year when weather conditions need to be considered. Then the cycle continues through a series of problem scenarios and with new and continuing component skill instruction until the learner is able to solve a complete problem without further explanation of component skills or any further assistance. So hopefully those 2 diagrams present some more detailed insight into problems, problem progressions, and component skills. So component skills are information, parts, categories, steps, examples that support solving the problems in the problem progression. Hopefully, and Stephanie, I didn't catch when you entered that question, but hopefully I addressed that question as part of the kayaking example, or at least gave a little bit more detail there. And maybe as we move forward with some other examples, which we'll move on to next, you'll also see a better definition of what those component skills are. And Patrice, I think you had the same question, and hopefully again we addressed that. So great. So now let's take a look at some examples. Again, as we move, I'm going to switch layouts and move to a different display. You'll still have the chat available, but do want to note, so please type your questions and comments in the chat while we're looking at some additional examples. Do want to remind you again of the full screen display, especially the first document that we go to. You may need, depending on your screen size, you may need to enlarge the presentation and then toggle back to participate in comments and everything else going on. But let's move to that layout now. So this is an example of a Pebble in the Pond instructional design document. I created this example documentation for my students based on the information examples presented by Dr. Merrill in the book. I'll also provide a link to this resource at the end of the session and again in the blog post. So don't feel that you need to note everything on here. You will have access to this at the end of the session. I just want to look at it briefly to present a more detailed example of problem-based learning, problem progression, and component skills. The problem description describes the circumstances and details of the problem. So we're looking at all of this information down here. So it describes the circumstances and details of the problem as well as the solution and consequences that result from solving the problem. The set of activities needed to turn the problem into a solution is also detailed, and the problem description, in this case on photographic composition, identifies simplicity, rules of thirds, format, framing, and line elements as solutions to the problem. These are the component skills and the overarching component skills. So when we talk about identifying problems and creating a problem-based solution, even the problem examples that I showed are just the very beginnings of that process. That's an example of the problem description and identifying a problem. Here is a description of the demonstration of the whole problem and the first step in the diagram that we just looked at. So where we had the different columns and I was moving the arrow around to 1, 2, 3, 4. This is a written example of that first step. Here are the problem portrayals. They are descriptions of a variety of photographic composition scenarios. So in this case, balancing the simplicity, rules of thirds, format, framing, and line elements becomes more complex with each problem portrayal based on the complexity of the photograph and the framing and again the composition of that photograph. Now I'd like to show you some example problem-based projects that were designed using the PIP principles. Sorry if you can't see anything but the green arrow. Hopefully that's not everyone, but this is a PDF document, and again you'll be able to link out to that at the end of the session when we share some resources. So it is hard to read. I was mentioning that you can go full screen, and that should make it a little bit easier to read. And again, I'm not going over this in any great detail, but just wanted to highlight what some of this looks like in a design document or as you move into a more specific topics and design elements. Etiquette of Business Networking was created for bank officers who are new to business networking or don't attend networking events often. The online training was created to replace and/or augment classroom training on the topic, depending on the employee or depending on the the timing of the employee needing this training. Learners are presented with business networking scenarios where they are asked to choose proper introductions, conversations, and contact gathering activities. An etiquette guide serves as component skill instruction and guidance throughout the scenarios, as well as a reference that can be printed and reviewed before business networking. The scenarios go through a variety of increasingly complex problem scenarios, addressing all of the component skills throughout. Spills in the Laboratory is classroom training created for lab technicians at a pharmaceutical company. Learning objectives are presented in a very applied manner, identifying the consequences and impact the training will have on the workplace. A whole problem scenario is presented to create context and identify component skills. Learners are presented with a scenario and asked how to react as their first experience. Component skills are explored as part of solving the problem. And component skills are demonstrated and reviewed in context with that problem. Legal Issues for Managers is online learning that was created to support and augment classroom training. The managers take the online learning before going to the classroom session. Learners are presented with a problem scenario. Steps and resources are provided as component skills within the context of solving that problem. Potential reactions to the request or solutions to the problem are provided as options to the learner and part of component skill instruction. And finally, information is provided as feedback within the context of the problem. So again, those are some simple examples of problem-based and problem-focused instruction, with the problem being at the center of all of the instructional experiences. So if you are full screen, you may want to come back into the full webinar room so that you can participate in the chat and also have access to the resources as we begin to conclude. So we will just kind of briefly walk through the final steps of the Pebble and the Pond model. I reviewed them already, but we'll highlight them again here, just again as an overview. Those first three steps really being the core of the model, and elements that are different from maybe some macro instructional design models or traditional or more overarching but not process-oriented micro-instructional design models. So enhancing strategies are focused on designing a structural framework for the problems in the progression. This is where peer sharing is designed, discussion, collaboration, and critique. A variety of interactive or even social learning elements can be incorporated here. And this is where metaphors and themes are identified that may help form a framework for learning and connecting to previous knowledge. And help form that framework for learning component skills and solving problems. Finalizing the design is focused on essentially usability, designing an appropriate interface, navigation, supplemental materials. You saw in the meeting etiquette there was a job aid that the component skills inventory could be printed out as a job aid. So, finalizing elements like that. Again, an emphasis on usability is part of the learning solution. And while interface lends itself to online learning, the way the learner interacts with the learning solution in general should be a focus of this stage of the process. And then finally, evaluation. And again, I'm sure a lot of us are, or most of us are familiar with this, and the focus and definition doesn't change much from many traditional ways. Evaluation being a focus on designing assessment opportunities and conducting a formative evaluation of your functional prototype or your first version of your learning solution. This stage represents the evaluation of the instructional material and emphasizes the importance of getting learner feedback and analyzing trial learning outcomes before fully releasing the learning solution. One element to consider as part of evaluation within a problem-based instructional design is that evaluation and assessment is happening throughout the learning solution. So this isn't focused on necessarily designing quizzes or drag and drop activities as much as it is focused on the evaluation of the materials, so getting feedback from learners, and as well the transfer to the workplace, and how is learning going to be evaluated, or how does what we've done relate to what people are going to be doing in the workplace, and how their learning is going to be evaluated in the workplace. And I have a couple questions in the Q&A that I'll answer before moving on to some other final comments here. So one question was, should each problem portrayals align to specific learning objectives? And if we go back a little bit here, whoop. Went back too far, sorry. If we go back here to this problem progression diagram, learning objectives are aligning to portrayals, and portrayals aligning to those objectives, but it is not necessarily one learning objective per portrayal, or that each learning objective is only represented once throughout the scenario. Again, that is something that is a benefit or a focus of this model, is that again continued practice and variety of practice. So hope I addressed your question there. And I have a number of people noting that they're not seeing things on the screen at different times. That may just be a reload of your browser, it could be your internet connection, and as part of the recording, we're capturing all this. So if there's anything that you miss, certainly we can address that. And do I see another question, do I see PIP as an iterative process? Most definitely. So we're looking at the model as, as steps, but especially those first 3 steps. And I'll try not to, I got to find my spot here. But those first 3 steps, problem, progression, and component skills, are definitely iterative. And all design models should include an iterative approach or an iterative element to them where, there is some linearity to it, but it is something that you're always coming back to the beginning stages to validate and iterate. Yes. So how do you suggest we bring business units on board with this approach? That's a really good question, and certainly the magic bullet, if you can figure that one out. But if you look at actually the, if you go back to the legal issues for managers example that I showed, we actually started that process with a simulation or a situation similar to what you're describing, where information was, the primary component and element, and especially in working with the legal department, if you get all the information out to them, then they're covered. They've done everything they need to do. They got the information out to the learners. What they do with it is is certainly of a concern to them, but from a legal standpoint, they're always looking at, did the person sign off that they did it, or did they sign off that we did our job? What we did is we gathered all that information first and then began to turn that into problems. So if we talk about iteration, we certainly didn't follow the model through its intent necessarily, but we almost started with component skills and then really turned that into a problem and problem progression. So as SMEs, subject matter experts, and internal clients or even external clients are dumping their reams of manuals or their 100-slide PowerPoint decks on you, look at taking that information and turning it into problems or situations. Certainly, it's easier to do that with their help, and depending on the subject matter, you may not be able to do it without their help. But I think turning those solutions or that information into problems for them and presenting it to them as, wouldn't it be better if people were actually using the information and solving the problems? Now, as part of that legal issues problem-based approach, we did have to compromise, and actually people could not solve the problem until they looked at all the resources. Now, again, all they had to do was open each of the resources. They didn't actually have to look at them. So we kind of found a solution to both needs. From the design perspective, we were presenting problems, and from the legal perspective, everyone was getting all the information or had at least looked at all the information. So hopefully that's going to address some of your concerns there, or at least a case study of that. There's no magic way of doing that. And a few other questions here that I'm going to hold off on, and just to make sure that we stay within our time limit here. And if I don't get to those, I will certainly address those in the follow-up blog post. So as I mentioned before, action mapping is something that's very similar to this. Action mapping is simpler than Pebble in the Pond, but it doesn't provide as much of a model or a framework or a guideline for component skills instruction in support of behavior practice. It really focuses more on providing the information that people need to know, but not necessarily developing the skills that they need to solve problems. Problem progression is also another important element of Merrill's PIP model that is not a part of action mapping. But if what you've heard today interests you and you haven't been using this type of technique before, then you should definitely check out action mapping. And I do have there's one that Alicia just put into the chat, but I'll also, I think it might even be the same link that we have as a resource for you here at the end of the session as we conclude. When you create a problem-based learning solution, you're 50% of the way there to creating a serious game. So just want to summarize here with a few thoughts on how we transition to game design as a part of problem-based learning. Essentially what we do in games is we solve problems. So games can be a natural progression from this problem-based learning approach. Now, it's not as easy as just slapping a score onto the interface. There are a lot of considerations to making a game that is balanced and has the right mix of game mechanics to meet the learning goals and still be a fun experience for the player. The Power of Research is a strategic, serious game that gives players the opportunity to slip into the role of a researcher. Players can engage in virtual health research projects by performing microscopy, protein isolation, and DNA experiments, publishing research results, participating in conferences, managing high-tech equipment, managing staff, or requesting funding, all tasks of real researchers. You can see how a game like this and a game experience like this could evolve from the problem-based lab safety example that we reviewed earlier, perhaps. Now, different learning objectives, both related to the lab, but examples of how maybe an example of how problem-based could evolve into game-based learning. In this game-based learning example, sales reps need to understand the effect that formulation type has on product performance in order to make appropriate product recommendations, address product challenges, and answer customer questions. In this serious game, the salespeople are playing a role that mimics the real-world context of their jobs. It is a problem-based learning environment where they must achieve sales goals to succeed. The additional game elements create more emotion in the experience, increase motivation and engagement, create competition, and potentially extend the replayability of the learning experience, so people desire to come back to it often and again and again. So again, just touching there on game-based learning and how a problem-based approach can translate or transfer into that. So this is what we set out to do today. If you've continued interest in micro-instructional design, there's going to be, again, a follow-up blog post that I'll write, and next we'll make some resources available to you. Before going to the resources, I want to display my contact information again. Please contact me if you have any questions about working with students on a problem-based instructional design, any questions about micro-instructional design in general, or any questions about the Learning Technologies Master's Program. And so as the screen loads here, I want to point out the resources on the left side. And again, my arrow is going to point in the wrong direction, but over here by the arrow. And that includes a link out to the book. So if you click on any of those resources, the Browse To button should become active, and you can just click Browse To and link out to that resource. We'll also, obviously, you'll have access to these through the recording, and then as a follow-up through the blog post as well. As we conclude, just want to again thank TrainingPros for their part in today's session and highlight some of their services and a way to contact them. And apologize again that David wasn't able to participate today because of some of the audio issues that we have, but want to highlight his experience and his role at TrainingPros. And again, some of the services that TrainingPros provides to their clients and the types of consultants that they place. And finally, a little bit of information about Harrisburg University. I would ask if you can stick around to give us some feedback on the session that you do so. Just have a few slides here that I want to highlight regarding our programs, and those are our undergraduate programs and our Learning Technologies Master of Science program as well, and a link out to some more information if you'd be interested in that. We have classes online in Harrisburg, in Lancaster, and in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. And then some of our concentrations, including our instructional design concentration with an element of micro-instructional design that I described earlier through the course, and then a serious games and simulations concentration as well. And some of the professional education webinars and workshop topics that we offer. And web panelist series that you may be interested in. So we have 4 panelists on the 4th day of the month at 4 p.m. And these are some of the upcoming dates and topics. You can click out to the 444.harrisburgu.edu link to learn about that. Right now, we don't have any information up about these sessions. We'll be getting them up shortly, but you can see other sessions that have been held. And then our next Learning Views webinar is on creating online and blended learning, and that'll be on May 20th. I'll be doing another Learning Views webinar session at that time. So I'm going to move to the feedback screen, and I would love to get your feedback on the session. The chat will remain, and we'll actually exit or end the session from there. I want to thank you again for joining today and for your participation in the chat and your questions throughout. And for those of you providing examples and resources in the chat as well, definitely appreciated. Love the community aspect here. So as you go to the feedback, you'll be able to just click on a response, and that response will automatically register. You do not have to enter anything. And then there is a section to gather input on other topics that you may be interested in learning about. And then finally as well, the resources are still in the bottom left of this space, so feel free to link out to some of those if you haven't done so already. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks for joining us.